Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are. On behalf of everybody here at Insum, I'm very pleased to welcome you to the second session in our Insum 2019 Fall Webinar Series. So I want to thank you for taking the time to come and see us. Today's presentation is entitled, Who's Who in Apex? My name is Mark Ruel from the Insum marketing team, and I'll be your moderator. Our series producer is Marc-André Brassard. Just a couple of things before we start. Your mics are muted, and we'll be taking questions in the questions panel, and we'll ask you to write your questions as they come to you, but please note that we'll be fielding the questions at the end of the presentation during question period. So our presenter today is Adrian Ping. Oracle Ace Adrian Ping, Senior Apex Consultant at Insum, is a senior programmer analyst with over 20 years of experience in software development, database administration, and system administration roles. He's been on the board of directors of the British Columbia Oracle User Group, the BCOUG, since 2012, and is also the founder of the Vancouver Oracle Apex Meetup Group, which recently celebrated its 4th birthday. As a prolific blogger on Apex, OCI, Autonomous DB, blockchain, and other cutting-edge technology, mostly on his blog Thinking Anew, Adrian is a well-known member of the Apex community. You may also know him as the originator of the Apex Challenge coin. You can read his latest article on delivering Oracle Database 18c Express Edition in containers in this month's edition of Oracle Magazine. And without further ado, let's begin. Adrian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. And as Mark kindly said already, thank you all for joining me today. I really appreciate you spending the time to find out what I have to present to you today. So typically I would have flashed a couple of pictures, played a little game where I'll ask you over a series of photos who these people are, but because we're doing this in a webinar format, I don't get to see you, I don't get to see people answering questions. So what I'll do is I'll just kind of quickly flash out these 18 pictures, gorgeous people that we have here. I believe Jorge in the last webinar would have shared to you who are these people in the Apex development team. But my focus today with this slide is really to show members of our own community, people who like me generate content. Some of us, like Daniel on the top left, does lots of plugins, and some of them write books. Some of them are known for their UI designs, and really at the bottom you see also a list of people who come out and do stuff for the community. And on the bottom left, you might find representatives on board of directors on ODTAT, for example. And of course, on the bottom right, we have a little tiny picture on the here, and that's Jürgen Schuster, who's largely responsible for Apex World, whom I hope you're already a member of. So one of the questions I would ask is that, you know, if one of these people came up to your doorstep one day, knocked, would you let them in? And if you recognize them, you will naturally let them in, assuming that they are your friends, as Niels would like to say. And we have the advantage where if I see with my eyes, I can believe. And so then you are who you say you are. But in reality, when we deal with web applications, we don't know for a fact. And that's really the focus of my presentation today, is to talk about authentication and how we deliver that solution in Apex. So I'm lesser known than the 18 people that I presented. As Mark shared, I work with Insum. I've been doing Apex development for almost 10 years now. And I've been, for the last couple of years, been an active member in the local community. I do want to make a plug for the BCOUG. Next year, we will have a tech day sometime in May. So if you're interested, keep a lookout for a call for papers. But other than that, if you wanted to find out about what I write, what code that I share, please feel free to look for me in any of these links over here. Just a couple of notes about Insum. So Insum, of course, is sponsoring and hosting this webinar today. We are very heavily involved in Apex and offer a wide range of services, including custom application development, forms modernization. We're deeply involved with consulting and teaching Apex as well. So if there's anything that Insum could possibly help you, please feel free to reach out to us. So a brief look at what we're going to cover today. I will begin by first talking about Apex and how it kind of positions in the enterprise with particular attention to security, of course. We'll look at some of the various Apex authentication schemes that we could use in our applications. And I won't go through all of them in the interest of time. And then we'll briefly look at the differences between authentication and authorization. And if there is time, I would actually like to talk a little bit about SCIM, which is something I kind of newly learned about early on in this year while working for a customer. And finally, we'll end off by talking about the considerations that we need to make when we make the choices that we have to when we design an application. So is Apex ready for the enterprise? I think this point has been debated many times, and of course, if you are an Apex nerd, the answer is for sure it is, right? But how do we explain that it is to our customers? Apex is modular, just like Lego, where we stack up blocks, and a lot of web applications are basically built up upon blocks. And I like to use this diagram a lot because it presents what are the different layers of a web application that we need to focus on. What is important, though, is that in this layered approach, the specialists of whichever domain can focus on what they really do best, while us application developers will focus on something that matters to users and really makes or breaks us as a professional. And that is really getting data models correct and making sure that we implement business logic correctly. And we shouldn't really worry about all the other things. One thing that we shouldn't worry about really is authentication. And by no means I'm not saying that it's not important. It's just that in enterprises, typically there is a standards that we have to kind of follow. And it would be nice, rather than reinventing the wheel, designing our own authentication methods, that we adopt what the industry or the companies has already adopted. And I think that's really important for even as a user, because it's our first impression of any application, and we have to try and reduce the amount of hurdles that somebody gets to your application. And just take for example, like for me, my daily work routine would be going to check my emails on Office 365, and so we have this landing page, right? And really what I like when I'm ready to do the real work is to have a link that I can click on and go right into my my app builder and just cracking on the code. And that's what single sign-on would actually help us achieve, and that's going to be part of what I'm going to talk about today as well. The key thing about single sign-on, though, is that it gives us the opportunity to set certain rules and standards as an organization. Things like, don't put your pet name or your birth dates as a password, like without making it challenging for the user. Imagine if I had to come up with cryptic passwords for 10 different applications with their 10 different authentication schemes. It would be hell, and that's why we have the problem where people use simple passwords and as a result cause issues down the road. The other thing, of course, is that we can always, at the highest point, at the highest level, enforce certain additional enhancements that will protect our applications, things such as multi-factor authentication. So here are a list of 9 authentication schemes today that we can use. The most common being application express accounts. But for today, I'd like to really just focus on 4 because past history dictates that I would probably run out of time, and I like to then maybe focus on something that, as you know, if you worked within an enterprise context, they would probably be most important to you. The LDAP authentication is perhaps one of the oldest that has been with us for quite a while. It is a protocol standard, which then you would have many different vendors coming up with products. And there are proprietary ones, there are open source solutions, things that cost you money and things that don't. And it really depends on what your company IT folks decide on as a gold standard. It does store information just very much like a database, but it stores them in hierarchical formats. The key thing about it is it organizes things into groups, and essentially you're capturing information about entities, and entities do not have to be users. They can also be certain resources like computers and whatnot. The key thing though is that the LDAP does specify a way of querying the information, and it's with that basis we have this Apex authentication method. So here's a very simple example of what an LDAP entry might look like. This is presented in LDIF, which stands for LDAP Data Interchange Format. Typically, we would identify the entities with a distinguished name, and it would also include other information, including passwords. But the attributes here really depends on what kind of classes you kind of assign them to. But this amount of information is actually enough for you to kind of get started with LDAP authentication. Before I actually do any demo on LDAP authentication, I just wanted to revisit the concept of single sign-on and ask the question whether LDAP is truly a single sign-on solution. From my perspective, to centralize your user repository does not translate to single sign-on. And the reason why I say that is because even though we can create an LDAP authentication scheme, if you had to go to another application, whether it's in Apex or maybe it's a Java web application, there is no seamless transition from both environments, and that would cause the user to re-authenticate. There are, of course, different solutions. In Apex, typically what we might do is to do sessions sharing within workspaces. Recently, we've seen some examples of how we could use JSON Web Tokens. But there are other methods like using SAML2 and OAuth2. But let me first kind of go through the LDAP demo and then also demonstrate how this where single sign-on for LDAP, just pure LDAP, actually breaks. So a lot of my demos I could run on my machine, and if you wanted to experiment, a good way to kind of get started is really to use Docker. And here I'm actually running an Apex instance, and I've got an LDAP directory running. And on top of that, I needed a web application to manage my data. So this is running off my Docker instance, and I'm just going to log in as an administrator to create accounts. There you go. And as I mentioned, there is some form of hierarchy in the LDAP. And what I've done basically is to organize my users in a organizational unit, which is called HR. And I've already one entry. And just to kind of demonstrate how simple to add a user, I'm just going to take my sample LDIF. I have the second user here with a predefined password. Oops. And now I have a user by the name of Jane Smith. And in Apex, I have an application where I've already configured my LDAP authentication scheme. And essentially what you would need is an LDAP host where your directory lives. In my case, it would just be localhost. I'll need to specify the port number and then the DN string, which is really a pattern. We have to specify the LDAP user, and if you look at the help, it would kind of explain what it is. It's really just a placeholder where when you enter your username, they would just replace that string with the username you entered. And it's using that they basically do a challenge to make sure that you are authentic, and then they'll log you in, set the app user and all that. And we're just gonna see that actually working here. So I had just created a user, J Smith, and I have a very secret password. And I'm in. So that's LDAP authentication, and it's very easy to kind of do. The most difficult challenge, especially I think if you're working with Active Directory, is to kind of establish what the search filters are like. And different organizations have different ways to kind of organize their tree and might actually cause you issues. So this is one tough nut that you would best work with the administrator who takes care of the directory services. And the other thing, of course, is in my case, running this LDAP directory, in order to pass it, I have done the easy way out where I said, I don't need authentication to look up the tree and stuff like that. But in real world, that's usually something that you have to grapple with, and you just got to make sure that you got all the right pieces into it. So we talked about single sign-on, and what I did was basically to clone this same application. And what I wanted to do is kind of transition to that partner application, and I'm going to see if I'm going to be able to log in straight away, or do I have to re-enter my credentials? So the answer is probably yes. You would have guessed yes. I would have to enter my passwords again, and it's just a mess, right? So I've gone ahead to set the partner application to allow workspace cookie sharing, and I'm just going to do the same for this application. And it's as simple as just switching the type and hitting apply. So if I were to go back to my last application, and forget I'm not logging as myself, I would now be able to transition smoothly because the authentication cookie is being shared. But I will highlight if you notice in the last application, you would actually see my display name. I had a post login method that queries the tree again. So after you log in, I would be able to go back to the tree while I still have the password, and then look up information about the user and try and get the display name and employee number and set that in the session state. But because I had set this up as an application scope, I only see it for my app, right? But what I really want would be to set it for global. And I'm just going to make one change there. I'm going to log out of both sessions. Just going to restart my application. and now you see that information is being transferred over across my different sessions. So this is just one way, but I'm not a huge fan of this approach, and but you know, if it's something that you have to grapple with, it is what it is. What I'm actually more fond of is methods such as social sign-in. It sounds like a cheesy word, but it's really OAuth2 under the hood. OAuth2 is yet another protocol, a standards-based method for sharing tokens and you know, being able to rely on third parties to authorize usage of information about a particular user. And the way it works generally is that you have applications first registering with the third party, and I would call them identity providers, or IDP for short. And typically when they would have a method for you to kind of register your application and be able to generate a client ID and a secret. And these are important because they're used in the back and forth transaction between your application and the IDP. And you would need to get things from the IDP, such as the authorization code or an access token, and these play a huge role in establishing who your application is and verifying that your application is who you said it is. The tokens are temporal, so there are methods to refresh it. I don't believe this is available for the authentication scheme, but generally there's a way to kind of refresh the tokens, and that way with that token, as long as it's alive, what you can do with it is to then query other REST endpoints to get further information. And this is actually the same approach that the authentication scheme actually uses. To describe that a little bit better, I have this authentication flow. So you would see in a typical setup, you have your users talking to OAuth or Apex, and then it also interacts with the IDP and any other providers of information. Typically, it's the same endpoint, or rather the same provider. So if I try to access a particular protected page, the first thing that Apex would ask is whether you're authenticated. And if app user is not set, then I would have configured it such that, okay, I'm supposed to then look to Google or Office or Facebook to get my identity established. So what that IDP would then do is to present the login page for users, and then you would enter your username and passwords for whichever provider you have. And if you enter the correct credentials, it would then redirect to the Apex authentication callback with an authorization code. Now, once Apex receives this authorization code, it would then talk again back to the IDP to say, can I get an access token? And at that point, I'm actually presenting both my client ID and my secret. And that establishes the application for who it is. And if all that checks out, an access token will be returned to Apex, and then it would use other endpoints, REST endpoints for Office 365, for example. It uses the Graph API to then get things like your email, which we might use for your app user name. So once Apex has everything checked out, app user set, it then redirects you to where you originally intended to be at. So in order to get yourself set up for social sign-in, you must first, of course, make sure that the IDP does support OAuth2, and a lot of them do these days. There are lots of providers that you can look to, not just your usual social networks. But the other question you like to ask about the OAuth2 providers is whether they have OpenID Connect support. And this is sometimes I get confused as well. This OpenID is not really the old days when we said OpenID. It's really something that they've put on top of OAuth2, and they have this thing called a discovery URL, which contains things like the authorization endpoint, the token endpoint, and the user endpoint. So everything's kind of packaged in that JSON. And once Apex retrieves that, it should be able to use those to communicate with the IDP. Then it makes life a lot easier. You have to, of course, make sure that your database, and you have to work with the DBAs to make sure that you can communicate with the endpoints through the database. And there are a couple of calls that are using Apex Web Services, and these are really the ones that that need the ACL. One example would be the user info endpoint, and the other would be the token. Authorization, if you look at how things flow in the application, it's really just a redirect. So that piece you can kind of well, ignore, but they do use the same domain, so it's kind of moot. Certificates is always an essential piece to security. I would strongly suggest not avoiding it, and these days there's no real need to bypass it, since even for the XE in 18C we do have access to the Oracle wallet. You will have to again find out what the developer site is so that you can generate the necessary client ID and secrets. So make sure you do that, and once you have that information, you're pretty much ready to go. And also, you have to find out, things like what kind of scopes that you need to get the authority to use. This is a little bit problematic. I believe there was somebody out there who was trying to kind of accumulate all the various providers and what are all the different scopes, URLs. If I do find that resource, I'll post it online someday. But it does require quite a bit of research. But if you're working with kind of established ones, they're pretty much out there, and you just have to look for it. So I did have a request to kind of show how we set it up. I'm going to just use my account. So this is the new approach that Microsoft established for us to kind of register our application. It used to be something like developer.microsoft.com, but that site has been obsolete since I believe early May this year. So the link that you really want to go to is portal.azure.com, and as long as you have a Microsoft account, you would be able to access it. So it's clearly evident that I'm going to actually show the Azure integration for OAuth 2. So it's pretty straightforward. A couple of things that you actually need to do is to make sure, first of all, you set the redirect URI. Because I'm running off localhost, it is allowing me to use HTTP protocol, but in some providers, they are very strict on what you could use. It has to actually be over SSL. But the string behind is pretty much the same. Yeah? It's just really calling the Apex callback. In this more modern interface, you also be able to specify, what kind of accounts can be accessed. And in Office 365, you can actually restrict it down to just your company's account, and that's actually a good thing. The other thing you need to do is, of course, generate the client secret, and you can establish a expiration date. But just be quick to record down what the secret value is, because you'll need it. And that's it. Next thing you need to do is to go back to Apex, and first and foremost, we go to Shared Components and create a credential. I've gone ahead to create one. Like, you specify the name, and then between the two, just select OAuth Client Credentials Flow. For Client ID, it's actually up here. And you just have to copy this and put that in there, and then of course your secret. Anton Nielsen did write a blog post about client secrets, and I've seen this happen to me before. Is that sometimes the secret that's generated is bad, right? And you actually need to do URL encoding. So get the URL encoded string and put that in, then hopefully you won't have those issues. Alternatively is to regenerate one if you have a questionable string that's generated. The other thing I would like to highlight as you work on figure out the correct setting and all that, sometimes you'll notice, oh, I've done an authentication, and you might see that we actually have tokens here, and it actually conflicts with how you're trying to get set up. And I actually had this happen to me during a demo as well. So if that happens to you, there is always this button that says clear token. It kind of resets your credentials, and you'd be good to kind of try again. So going back to the application, once I have the credential set up, I would then next set up the authentication scheme. So like any other authentication scheme, you would create one and then select the scheme type. So I've chosen social sign-in. Maybe in future we'll see it bracket OAuth2. And then we set the credential that we've created. Now, because Microsoft provides the discovery URL that I was talking about, the OpenID Connect, and this was brought up by somebody who had commented on my site, and I'm very thankful for that. It makes my life a lot easier. There is one URL that you need to kind of get. There might be variations depending on how you restrict access, but pretty much I just need to enter that information, specify the scope. In this case, I'm going to need profile and email, and during the logon process, the user will be asked to provide your application the access. And finally, I specify that I would want to use the email as the username. So if I went ahead to run my application, I would log in. Password. Oh, look, two-factor authentication. So here's where it's going to prompt. And if I wanted to use the application, I had better say yes. So just always be sure to check, what the application is really trying to access before you do say yes. And if I've configured everything correctly, I would have logged in. I did want to point out that there is this sign out, and in the context of single sign-on, this sign out is kind of meaningless in terms of per application, because when you sign out, if you don't sign out from the single sign-on, the IDP, then you will just re-authenticate when you're redirected to your home page. So to make sense out of this, you should actually consider specifying a post logout URL. And in this case, I know it's going to be this, such that if I had to go log out at this point in time, it would kill my session, but it would then redirect me to Microsoft's page for logging me out. And at this point, I can say yes. And that's when I'm kind of completely logged out. But as recommended, always close your browser to be thoroughly sure. Just gonna bring myself back to the screen. Okay, so OAuth2 is one, but we've had another alternative for doing a true single sign-on, and that's the header authentication method. This is would be a typical setup. In the past, I've worked with something called NetAccess and the NetIQ Access Manager, and what it does really is just to make sure that you are who you are, and it's got its own internal IDP, and it looks up an LDAP tree, for example, before it qualifies you to go in. And similar to OAuth2, you would see that it would interact with an extra piece, that's the access gateway. But I'm going to work through the flow really through SAML2, and the reason why is because if you've read a blog post that I did a couple of, well, it's probably a year now, where we talked about how do we implement SAML2 in a very simple and convenient approach. Quick bite about SAML. SAML is a markup language. It's XML based, but it also incorporates a lot of PKI, public key infrastructure methods, where you have to digitally sign messages, and that's how it kind of establish identities between machines, and rather than relying on client ID and secrets. It is also an industry standard, and you can always add things that you want to put in that XML package. Like header authentication, the approach is about the same, where you have a user interacting with a gateway, and at this point it would actually be an Apache with a mod auth melon. That's an Apache module. It would establish the user identity, and if it doesn't find it, it will redirect to an external IDP. And that IDP, like in Auth2, would then request that you sign in. And if you're good in the request from authmelon, is something called the assertion consumer service URL, which is really the redirect URL that we see in Auth. That tells authmelon that, okay, I've got something, here's the response, and if the response is valid, I can take the information from that response, tease out what I need to inject as an HTTP header, and then Apex will be configured to look at that, and if you're good, you're good, you're in. So that's how the new layout will look like. The only key difference is that, of course, your IDP is on the outside. Couple of steps that you need to do. The important one is to actually be able to then generate the metadata which it uses. It's kind of akin to registering on a website and stuff like that. But what it does is it generates a private key and a certificate, as well as a metadata which they use for interacting with the IDP. As a developer, the ones that you also have to look out, things like the single logout service, which we use for logging out, and then of course the assertion consumer service, which we use when registering the application. There's this little concept about the ID as well, and that's required to install to register your application. And I'm just gonna kind of quickly walk through it. So the ID here is something that we have to do in the new interface, actually fudge with the manifest, and I'm just going to show that to you in a short minute or so. Here we go. So here I am with a very different account. I have also under the Active Directory app registrations, very similar to Auth2. The registration is about almost the same. The difference being, of course, the authentication. We use the ACS over here rather than the Apex authentication callback, which we don't use. There are differences. We don't generate a secret key. And then here's the manifest that I was talking about, where you have to manually enter the entity ID over here. And with that, you are pretty much done. I wanted to also highlight something about this interface. You'll see it in this setup where you have this link where it says endpoint. You have to look at the federation metadata document, which you have to download. It's an XML file, which then you have to specify in your Apache configuration as well. The other thing I wanted to kind of talk about is that, in this set of endpoints, it does also give you things that you need for doing your Auth2 authentication. I'm just not sure why my personal account doesn't have this, but it's a very useful utility. So we head back here. In Apache setup, typically you would have configuration file, and I have one specifically just to do all the proxy, and it's actually as simple as specifying certain things like the stuff you generated, the metadata, as well as the linking to the IDPs that you wanted to talk to. You also translate from the XML what you like to use as, for example, a username. And the rest of it is really typical Apache configuration that you use for proxying an ORATS service. The key difference is that we also inject the app, whatever I specify as the header. And if you looked at the demonstration, that's what I actually specify. And here you have the logout. And this is pretty much all you need to do for header authentication. And it's super simple. the only thing I wanted to kind of caution, and that's about security. There's a huge problem with the header authentication, and that's the rule that you should probably not allow any kind of external, even internal, within your own intranet access to the auths. And the reason is because if you could do a bypass, you have this problem. So for example, if I have to run this application and straight off from Apex, and you know that it's not going to happen because this variable is not set, right? But here I already know what that value is expected of me. I could use a simple extension, put in anything I want, and if I were to refresh this page, I'm automatically signed in as the person that I want to sign in as. And if your authorization schemes are kind of based on this username, then you're kind of hooked because I didn't have access to everything. So just bear that in mind. If you're going to set this up, always protect the web application server. So briefly about custom authentication, why it's important. We probably use that a lot to do things like, search up a user table that is in your schema, but it gives us an opportunity to implement various functions, and it's actually through custom authentication that I can actually look at different approaches like setting up two-factor authentication. And here's just a couple of steps that it's in the documentation where the flow of how Apex actually does authentication. And the key piece here is that you have things like doing a post login, and that helps a lot in implementing something that I'm pretty fond of. If you notice, when I signed on with Office 365, I was asked to do a second step. And there are many ways to kind of get that token. You can use time, which time-based one-time passwords, which is my preferred method. You can also get it through SMS or even email. So if you, like me, use a token, you can use something like Google Authenticator. There are other solutions out there where it makes use of time to generate, having a secret and time between your device and the application that does the checks to kind of verify that you both can produce the same hash, or rather the same 6-digit code, for example. And if you're interested, we do have a demo. This library is all available on Aura open source, and you can actually get a sample app from there to see how it works. The key thing is that you don't really have to deviate too much away from how you might have already established a custom authentication with a user table. You just need to introduce certain things like having a shared secret and whether to store that the user has enabled TFA. You'll need to build in process in your user registration where a user has to proactively enable, because you don't really want to do this without the user getting involved. And I'll kind of show you why later on when I do the demo. Here's the authentication flow that I did in, and you see this in the demo app that you can download. Basically, we'll do a typical challenge, and then we'll look at that field, that column in the database which says whether or not we need to do a second challenge, and that's when you then redirect the user to a second page, which we then try and get that code and get that validated, and if it's good, we're approved. So very quickly, I'm going to use a more recent version that I did for a client because I just think it's a little bit more cool. So here I'm going to log in with my password. Now, if you store my password, you could do the same. If you had the link, you could probably get in as me. So I'm going to try and stop that, right? And here I am logged in. I'm going to go to my user profile, and I'm going to say enable multi-factor for myself, and I want to use a token. So before I can actually hit save, I will need to kind of scan this QR code, and it goes into my application, and then it will start generating codes, which I then use. And I'm just gonna generate one quickly to be able to register. I've set it up such that I have 30 seconds to kind of get this done. And I'm in, so it's all saved. So the next time, if I try to log in, I'll then be prompted again. I'm just gonna wait for a few more seconds to get a new code. I could really use the same one, but it wouldn't be so fun. So I've got a new one. I'm in. So that's two-factor authentication, and it, if anything, you have to do with your, you've heard so many things about how there are data breaches and stuff like that. This is one better way to kind of protect yourself, and I do sincerely encourage everyone to kind of have that enabled on all your web accounts if you can. The last one that I kind of wanted to quickly look at was WebAuthn. I'm still pretty much in the process of developing the code, but essentially what WebAuthn is it requires on a physical device as well. It's something like this little FIDO device where you plug it into your USB device, and newer browsers will actually know how to work with this, and a lot of things that goes under the hood, things like JavaScript interacting with the browser API, and then on the back end to be able to do complicated stuff like checking signatures and stuff like that. The process is still rather challenging, and I'm still working my way through it, but here's just a little teaser that I kind of did. If I had the opportunity to show it to you live, it would have been so much more fun, but that's me trying to log into my app, and because I've already registered my device, all I had to do was just click on the authenticated login. The browser prompts me, and this is actually connected to my computer. A simple click and I'm logged in. So that's it, kind of very quickly, and it's a broad subject for authentication. Could probably take multiple sessions to kind of get through, but I only have about 15 minutes to kind of get everything done. The next section that I want to kind of make clear was that authentication and authorization are really similar. They are related concepts, but they're different. It's a difference between who I am and what I am. So in the context of, in the beginning when we were talking about who's who in Apex, when I asked the question about do you recognize the person, that's authentication. So if you see, for example, Dimitri, like it's him, but do you let him into your house? If you ask Niels, he will say, why not? Dimitri is his friend, and that is authorization, right? So you have identity, the person, and who that person is to you. That's authorization. There are many methods in the Apex these days. In the past, it was just all about authorization schemes, where you can find different approaches to doing things like querying a table, writing PL/SQL functions to establish a true or false. You can also write plugins. So like I had one previous work where I had created a LDAP authorization plugin simply because to rewrite the piece where I took the identity to go up to a LDAP tree to then look up the membership that the user belongs to. That was just really tedious. So I kind of packaged that into a plugin, and that made it far more easier to kind of implement in all the different applications that I was working with. In later versions of Apex, we have access control. We've seen this used a lot in the package apps, and it was made available to us. Just a couple of key points that I wanted to point out was that there are wizards to kind of help you add, and it's nice, right? But and it used a lot of build options and app settings to kind of help you help you go along and implement these functionality. But if you wanted to remove them, just be careful. It's a lot more involved than it's documented. So the little bonus piece that I kind of wanted to touch on was about SCIM. And SCIM is interesting, but yet it's also an expensive option because typically people who support SCIM, which really stands for System for Cross-Domain Identity Management, it's usually a premium paid plan that you have to go with the identity providers. I know people like Azure do it, GitHub as well. So where if you were to create an Office 365 account, for example, it would then be able to synchronize the user base and do other stuff on your application side, right? And it's just a standard where using a REST API, you are actually the IDP is actually able to say to the application or the enterprise, you know, we have this new user, do what you need to do, and it's a whole bunch of post update and stuff like that. One caveat though is the protocol, I believe, does require certain HTTP methods. One of them is called patch, and right now I believe Auth doesn't quite yet support that. And how necessary it is, I think not very, because there are other methods which it then uses to kind of create and delete users. But again, as I said, it is a paid option for most providers, so that's just food for thought. So that brings me to the very last few slides. When we're dealing with security, authentication, stuff like that, compliance is always a huge part of the deal. Make sure that you meet these requirements. If you're in healthcare, there are things like don't store passwords in the clear and stuff like that. You have to see, of course, whether or not your organizations do have established standards, and as far as possible, you should try and accommodate to those, because they help you, one, to get buy-in from users, but also buy-in from the organization, whether it's the owners or other role players in your environment that you have to work closely with to get this set up. For example, your DBAs. If you have different platforms in your environment, single sign-on is best to kind of switch between them, and all of them should try and support the same protocol. And last but not least, of course, there are issues of cost, right? So SCIM is nice, but can we afford to pay Microsoft that huge subscription fee for a premium account? It depends. So I hope I've shown how Apex is really like Lego, where you can plug in things and get it all working. And given all it supports, I hope you agree with me that it is definitely enterprise ready. I hope you can also agree that the two terms, while they are involved in the same workflow, they are not necessarily meaning the same thing. And always find balance in anything, and that includes security. We like to have simple passwords, simple ways to get in, but we also have to bear in mind that security first. There are a couple of resources, so you can grab them from the slides when they are released. And last but not least, I just wanted to share something that came from one of the customers that we worked with, and what this was really after we kind of helped them go through the hump of getting social sign-in done. And this is literally what she said. It is saving their organization a good amount of time dealing with things that are not essential in business at all. Like, users shouldn't be spending their day worrying about designing a super complex password or changing it every 90 days for 10 different applications. It should be just one. And with that, I just want to thank you again for your time. And if there are questions, I think we can take them.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adrian. And you're absolutely right. That's a very important part of authorization of ensuring proper authorization and single sign-on will help you save a lot of time in your enterprise. So that said, we can open the floor to questions. So if you have any questions, please write them out. We'll start handling the first ones. The first one is Adrian. OAuth 2 looks much more complex to set up. Is there an advantage to using OAuth 2 compared to social sign-in?
And this question came from Dick. I'm not too sure if you were referring to OAuth 2 compared to SAML2, because OAuth 2 and SAML2 are essentially, OAuth 2 and social sign-in are essentially the same thing. Social sign-in was the language that the Apex development team used in designing the authentication scheme. But if you do ask between OAuth 2 and SAML2, yes, SAML2 is a lot more involved in setting up because it does require an extra actor in the whole chain. And the other thing is header authentication gets people worried. And also there are other things like when I'm not too sure if you caught this early on, where basically I was protecting an entire endpoint. So anything that's being served by Apex at that point in time requires header authentication, and that way you don't have any fine-grained control where, for example, you may have application 100 where it requires header authentication, and you wanted maybe an app 101 where it was more for public consumption. You don't get a choice. It will always require you to do the sign-on. Whereas in social sign-in, you can't, because the authentication itself is dealt with at the lower level, which is within Apex.
Thanks.
Thanks for the question.
And also, Dick had a follow-up question, which was, will fingerprint authentication on your phone be possible?
Yes, so WebAuthn actually does include not only the FIDO device, which I was showing off. For Windows system, there is also the Windows Hello, which does rely on fingerprints. And I think later on, if you have things, so actually Windows Hello also has things like facial recognition. For example, you could use a camera to do face recognition.
Okay. And we had a comment saying that you mentioned a demo app, and if you tell us where to find it on Aura open source, that would be helpful. Well, we can do that after the session as well. When okay.
Yeah, and I'll just put it on screen again. Just
yeah.
Let me find that. There we go.
If there are any other questions, please write them down, and we'll get to them quickly. I know we only have a couple of minutes left of your time, but please don't be shy.
And Mark, we are sharing the slides, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. We'll be sending them out. We'll be sending a link out to the slides shortly this week. To the whole presentation, I mean, yeah.
Thanks.
So there it is. That's the exact link. Okay, we have another question here. Does the header method work with Apache on Windows as well as, or just Linux?
That's a very good question. The mod of Melon is pretty much, I think, a Linux thing. Because under the hood, it has a lot of dependency on dealing with XML and stuff like that. I don't believe they've written something for Windows, but it might be worthwhile checking, because it's actually Apache modules are written in C, and they kind of cross-compile for the different platforms. But I don't know offhand. I do hope I have the link. The end. Yeah, so if you go to this link, they would probably indicate what they do support. But yeah, that can be a challenge. Even between Linux releases. So I've done most of it in Oracle Enterprise Linux. And in 6 and 7, they use different libraries and different dependencies. In 6, they don't support the very latest version of the module, whereas in 7 they do. So those are stuff that you have to think about, because really this is on the front line. You want them to be updated. But also that's it. Do consider things like Docker, where the operating system at that point in time, the host operating system at the point in time doesn't really impede you.
Okay, we had an answer from Audemars who says that we use header auth with ISS under Windows with integrated Windows authentication. You can call this SSO. So that was his response to Florian's question.
Right.
And another question from Florian is, if you had to start a new application today and your company uses Office 365, would social login be your choice?
Yes, for sure.
Okay. Honestly, we're really at the end of our time here. It's now 3 o'clock Eastern time, and we would have to close unless there's any last quick questions. We'll be closing out the webinar. Of course, I want to thank everyone for taking time to come and see us at the webinar, and we really hope that you'll come to our future webinars. The next one being, well, actually, no, I won't announce that one yet. But if you are registered to receive our webinar alerts, you'll receive the next webinar. So thank you very much for attending. Well, one last question. Is the Facebook demo app publicly available? Thanks.
Facebook demo, I believe Dimitri did do a blog. I might have linked it here. Yeah, if you go to his, he does give you the various settings that you need to use for Facebook.
Great.
They're essentially all the same. It's just really where you get the information from and how you kind of register your application. So there's no real demo that I could share with you. It would be something that we'll provide as information. So I've got stuff on Google. I've got stuff on Microsoft. Anton, I believe he's got stuff on Microsoft as well. Dimitri, as I said, he's got Facebook as well, and I believe authentication switching. And I might have missed a few. So just look around and yeah, I think as we try and link up all these, hopefully we will find what you need.
Great. Well, if there are any other additional resources we can think of, we can send out with the email that we'll be sending all of you. So again, thank you. And to stay up to date on our webinar calendar, please check out insum.ca/resources/webinars. And so that concludes the presentation today. Thank you again, Adrian. And a recording of the session will be sent to you very soon this week. And on behalf of everyone at Insum, thanks all for your time. Hope to see you soon. And goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.